The flatbed rolled in around 8 that morning, tires crunching down the tractor lane like it owned it, and by the time it stopped at the edge of my wheat stubble, the man behind the wheel had already decided what he thought of me. Tuesday, the 10th of August, 1971. Hot enough that the dust hung in the air instead of settling, and I was standing next to a combine that hadn't turned its own wheels since before my father was born, wearing my grandfather's canvas coat even though it was 90 degrees, because it still smelled like him, and I wasn't ready to stop that yet. The scrap dealer's name was Orville Tice, out of Hermiston, and he had a clipboard and a tape measure and a way of looking at a 17-year-old that made it clear he'd already spent the number in his head before he said it out loud. $40, he said. That's metal weight, and that's generous, seeing as half of it's rusted to lace. Behind him, two of my neighbors, Delbert Osgood and his brother-in-law, whose name I never did get straight, leaned against Delbert's truck with their arms crossed, waiting to see what the kid would do, the same way you wait to see if a calf will clear a fence it's got no business clearing. I said no. Orville laughed, the kind of laugh a grown man laughs at something he doesn't think requires a second thought. And Delbert laughed along with him, because that's what you do. And somewhere behind me, I heard my Uncle Wade let out a breath through his nose that meant he'd already had this argument with me twice that week, and lost both times, without either of us calling it a loss. The combine sat there through all of it, the way it had sat there for 33 years, half swallowed by blackberry vines on one side, its header caved in like a rib cage, paint gone to the color of a deer left too long by the road. Nothing about it looked like $40 was an insult. Nothing about it looked like anything at all, if you didn't know to look. I knew to look. I just didn't know yet what I was looking at. Orville folded his clipboard under his arm, told me I'd change my mind by September when the loan came due, and said it the way men say things they expect to be true, because they've been right about boys like me before. He wasn't wrong that a debt was coming. He was wrong about everything else, though he had no way of knowing that yet, and neither, if I'm honest, did I. What I did know, standing in that stubble field with the dust starting to move again in the little wind that always come up around 9, was that my grandfather hadn't kept a piece of junk in his back 40 for 33 years. He hadn't kept much of anything he didn't have a reason for. I just had no idea yet that before the wheat. If you enjoy stories like this, I've put together a special collection called The Land They Laughed At. 15 original farm and homestead stories you won't find on this channel. You can read them or listen to the complete audiobook ad-free with no interruptions. The link is in the description and pinned comment. Wheat was even out of that field. The telephone in our kitchen was going to ring all the way from a country I couldn't have found on a map, and that it would change the value of that rust pile from $40 to something no one in Umatilla County would believe until they heard it themselves. Now I ought to go back further, to the Tuesday in June when all of this started, because none of it makes sense without that day. It was June 8, 1971, a little past 7 in the morning, and I was in the milking parlor with our 2 Jerseys, Bess and Clover, when Sheriff Dale Okerlund's Ford pulled up the lane, with its tires throwing gravel slower than usual, which is how you know a man is delivering news he doesn't want to deliver. My grandfather, Everett Pruitt, had gone out to check the wheat the evening before and hadn't come back. Dale found him sitting against the fence post along the county road, half a mile from the house, his hat still on, like he'd just decided to sit down and think about something, and his heart had disagreed with the plan. He was 76. The doctor in town said it was quick, which is the thing doctors say to boys my age, so we'll stop asking questions. The funeral was small, the Lutheran church on Tutuila Road, maybe 40 people, most of them men who'd bought seed grain from him, or borrowed his baler at one time or another. My Uncle Ray, my grandfather's only surviving son, drove up from Hermiston and stood next to me at the graveside, not saying much, which was normal for him. 3 days later, the county lawyer, a thin, careful man named Mr. Halverson, read us the will in his office above the hardware store, and that's how I learned I now owned 240 acres of wheat ground. A house with a leaking roof over the north bedroom, 11 head of cattle, a granary my grandfather had reinforced twice with his own hands, and a note at the Pendleton Grain Growers Co-op for $2,600, taken out the previous fall against a harvest that never came in worth what it should have. There was also a folded sheet of paper Mr. Halverson said my grandfather had asked him to keep separate from the will itself, in case I didn't understand what it meant right away. It wasn't a legal document. It was 3 lines in his handwriting, the same cramped hand he used in his feed ledgers, and it said, "Nathan, don't let anybody talk you out of the machine in the back 40. It's worth more than it looks. Ask no one but yourself what a thing is worth." I didn't know what to make of it that afternoon, standing in a lawyer's office in a borrowed black tie, with a debt over my head bigger than any sum of money I'd ever held in my hand. I folded the note into my shirt pocket and thought about the loan instead, the way a 17-year-old thinks about the thing right in front of him instead of the thing his grandfather was actually trying to tell him. 3 days after the reading of the will, on a Thursday morning, with the kind of low gray sky Umatilla County gets in late June, I walked the fence line out to the back 40 for the first time since I was maybe 12 years old. My father used to tell me to stay clear of that corner of the property, said the ground back there was soft in spots where an old irrigation ditch had caved in, and I suppose after enough years of being told a place is dangerous, you just stop going, even after the reason for staying away is gone. The wheat hadn't been planted that far back in a decade. It was mostly cheatgrass and thistle now, knee-high, and the fence posts leaned the way old men lean, like they were tired of holding up wire nobody checked anymore. I came around a stand of scrub locust, and there it was, sitting exactly where I remembered it, except smaller than I remembered, the way things from childhood always are. It was under a canvas tarp that had gone from army green to the color of weak coffee, torn in 3 long strips down one side, and blackberry vines had come up through the torn places and through the wheels and knitted themselves into the whole frame so thoroughly that from 30 feet off it looked less like a machine than like a hedge that had swallowed one. I had to cut my way in with a hand sickle, and the canes fought me, the way blackberry always does, taking a little blood for every foot of ground. Underneath, once I got the canvas peeled back in sections, it was uglier than I'd let myself picture. The header was bent where a header shouldn't bend. One of the drive wheels had sunk 8 inches into ground that had gone soft and then hard again around it, cementing it in place like a fence post set in concrete. Rust had worked itself into the sheet metal in long brown tongues, and there was a smell coming off it, cold iron and old grease gone waxy, mixed in with the green smell of the crushed vines. I ran my hand along the side panel, the way you'd run a hand along a horse you didn't trust yet, and about waist height, half buried under a curl of rust and lichen, I found a plate. Brass, or something meant to look like brass once, screwed down with 4 flathead screws gone the color of a shotgun shell. I worked the moss off it with my thumbnail. There was a serial number stamped into it, 7 digits, no letters, and above the number, in small block capitals, a manufacturer's name I had never once heard spoken in Umatilla County in my whole life. Not by my grandfather, not by my father, not by a single man who'd ever leaned on a fence and told me what a combine was worth. I stood there a long while, just looking at it, not understanding yet what I was looking at, only understanding that nobody I knew had ever looked at it either. That plate stayed with me longer than the rest of the wreck did, because it was the first proof I had that the machine hadn't just grown there like a boulder the glaciers left behind. Somebody had built it, somebody had sold it, and somebody, my own grandfather, Everett Pruitt, 30 years old that summer and not yet gray at the temples, had wanted it badly enough to hand over $310 for it on a Tuesday afternoon in July of 1938, out behind the granary, with his own father standing not 10 feet away calling him a fool. I know the date because it's the first entry in the ledger, though I didn't find the ledger for another 6 weeks yet. I know the rest because my Aunt Doris told it to me over pie, the way she'd heard it told 100 times at threshing suppers before I was ever born. The salesman's name was Orville Detz, and he came through Umatilla County in a Ford truck with wooden slat sides, hauling one demonstration unit and a satchel of order forms for a company out of Rock Island, Illinois, that nobody in 3 counties had heard of, before or since. He set up in the Pruitt North field on a Saturday morning and ran that combine through 40 rows of wheat, while half the township watched from the fence line, arms crossed, waiting for it to break. It didn't break. It threshed cleaner than the McCormick Deering everybody already owned, and it did it with some kind of double-cylinder arrangement. Detz couldn't fully explain himself, except to say the patent was pending and the company had big plans. My great-grandfather, Silas Pruitt, watched the whole demonstration without saying a word, and then said his word all at once, that no company nobody'd heard of, selling a machine built like nothing else in the state, was worth risking a season's wheat money on. He'd farmed through the drought years already. He didn't trust new. Everett bought it anyway, $310, most of it borrowed against that fall's crop. For a demonstration unit Dietz was glad to unload so he wouldn't have to haul it back to Illinois. Silas didn't speak to his son for the better part of a week, and the story goes he refused to let the thing park in the good equipment shed, which is the only reason it ended up wedged into the back 40, behind a fence row nobody bothered mowing. Not because it failed, but because a stubborn old man wouldn't make room for it, and by the time the stubbornness wore off, the manufacturer in Rock Island had already gone under. I stood there in August of 1971, with my thumb still resting on that brass plate, thinking that some arguments don't end when the men having them die. They just go quiet and wait in a fence row for somebody to come along and run a hand over the rust. That was the past. The present didn't care much about brass plates or arguments between dead men, and my uncle made that clear on a Wednesday morning 3 days later, standing in the kitchen with the co-op letter in his hand like it was a summons. $2,600, Nathan. He set it on the table, smoothed it flat with 2 fingers, the way he did when he wanted you to look at a thing instead of him. Pendleton Grain Growers isn't going to care that you've got sentimental attachment to a pile of rust. They want their money by the note date, and I don't have it, and you don't have it. And that scrap man's $40 is 40 more than we've got right now. It's not scrap, I said, which by then felt like the only sentence I owned. It's been sitting in a fence row since before I could walk. I watched blackberries grow up through the header bar. He wasn't cruel about it, that was the hard part. He said it the way you'd tell somebody the weather was turning, like it wasn't a decision he was making so much as a fact he was reporting. He'd farmed alongside my grandfather for 30-some years, and inherited none of the wheat ground, only the debt and the worry. And I think some nights he believed the machine had cost him as much as it ever earned anybody. He drove into Pendleton that Thursday afternoon without telling me. I found that out because Orville Detz, no relation to the salesman, just a scrap buyer who'd taken the name as a joke somebody had stopped finding funny, mentioned it to me himself at the Sinclair station, wiping his hands on a rag and asking if I'd come around on the price now that your uncle's already agreeable. I drove home doing 60 on gravel. I had no business doing 60 on. He was standing by the mailbox with a pen in his shirt pocket and a paper Orville had given him to think over. Not signed yet, just close enough that the difference didn't feel like much comfort. You didn't have the right, I told him, and my voice came out thinner than I wanted it to. I've got every right. It's still half mine on paper, till the estate clears, and the bank doesn't wait on paper. He folded the sheet along a crease already worn soft from handling. You want to keep it, you find me $2,600 by the note date. Otherwise, I'm signing this Saturday. I didn't have $2,600. I didn't have 26 anything, not stacked in one place. Not with the fall wheat check already promised 3 directions before it ever touched my hand. What I had was a brass plate with a stranger's name on it, a fence row of blackberries, and 3 days before Saturday to come up with a reason better than stubbornness. 3 days before Saturday, and I spent the first one just standing in the granary doing nothing useful, which is its own kind of work when your head's on fire. The granary hadn't been touched since before the funeral. Grandpa used the loft for seed corn overflow and whatever he didn't want Uncle poking through, which should have told me something years earlier than it did. I went up the ladder because I couldn't think of anywhere else to go that wasn't the house, where the paper with the pen crease sat on the kitchen table like a held breath. The loft smelled like dust and old canvas, and something underneath that, machine oil gone tacky with age. Behind a stack of burlap sacks folded flat, folded, not thrown, which was Grandpa's way of hiding a thing in plain sight, there was a wooden crate I'd never once seen opened. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and dark at the folds, were parts, gears the size of dinner plates, a length of chain still faintly greased, 2 flat pieces of steel punched with bolt holes that matched nothing I'd ever seen on a Massey or a McCormick, because they weren't meant to. Under the crate, flat against the floorboards, was a ledger, bound in leather, that had cracked white along the spine. I sat down right there in the dust and opened it, and the first page was dated September 1938, 3 months after the combine came off that traveling salesman's truck, and it was his handwriting, small and even, the same hand that wrote out the seed order every March. Every entry after that was a repair. A date, a part, a cost, sometimes a sentence, about what he'd had to fabricate because nobody made the piece anymore. 1941, threshing cylinder bearing, machined by hand, R. Voss Shop, Pendleton, $4 1949. Reinforced feeder housing, salvaged angle iron. 1956, replaced belt tension arm, second casting failed, kept the first as pattern. 33 years of a man keeping something alive that everyone else would have hauled to the scrapyard the first winter it broke down, because he must have known before I did, before the letter, before any of it, that there wasn't another one like it left standing anywhere. I read it by the light coming through the loft slats until the light wasn't enough anymore, and my hands were shaking some, not from the cold coming up through the floorboards. $2,600 was still $2,600. The ledger didn't pay a note. But I carried it down that ladder, holding it against my chest, like it might get away from me. And I understood something I hadn't let myself understand yet, standing at that mailbox, arguing over a piece of paper with a crease worn into it. That whatever this machine was worth to a stranger across an ocean, it had already been worth 33 years of a dead man's evenings, and nobody in this county had bothered to ask why. I went back through the ledger a second time that night, slower, at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up, because the first pass had been about the repairs, and the second pass was about something else I'd caught out of the corner of my eye going down the ladder. Near the front, tucked behind the receipt for the $310 purchase, there was a newspaper clipping folded into quarters, gone the color of weak tea. Farm Implement News, October 1941. 3 paragraphs. The manufacturer, Kessler Voss, out of a town in Iowa I'd never heard of and still can't find on most maps, had lost a patent suit over the threshing cylinder design to a bigger outfit with lawyers enough to bury them. The company dissolved that winter. Assets liquidated. The clipping didn't say what happened to the other 2 units built off that patent, but my grandfather had written in the margin, in pencil gone soft with age, both gone by 52, so far as I can learn. So far as I can learn. Like he'd asked around, like he'd written letters, made calls, tracked down what became of machines that weren't his to track. There were years in that ledger where the wheat barely cleared expenses, 1934, 1940. A bad stretch in the late 40s I'd heard my father mention only once, and in every one of those years there was still an entry for the combine, $1.50 for gasket material, $2 for a used bearing off a implement dealer in LeGrand. Small money, but money he didn't have, spent on a machine that by any sane accounting should have gone to salvage the first year it broke an axle. He never sold it. Not when the bank called the note in '37, not during the drought years, not when a fair price for scrap iron would have covered a season's seed. On the last page, with writing on it, dated sometime in 1958, there was a line that wasn't about parts or dollars at all. Somebody ought to remember how a thing was built, even if the company that built it is 30 years in the ground and nobody left alive who worked the line. Underneath it, nothing. He hadn't explained himself further, and I sat there wanting him to. Wanting one more sentence that told me why a wheat farmer with 2 sons and a mortgage cared so much about the memory of a bankrupt company's threshing design that he'd spend money he didn't have to keep its last surviving example turning over every harvest. I didn't have an answer that night. I had a ledger, a stack of oilcloth-wrapped parts, still upstairs in the loft, and a debt that hadn't moved $1 since morning. But I knew, sitting there, that I wasn't going to be the one who let it go to the scrapyard either. Not without understanding first what he'd understood, and not before I'd had the chance to prove it to somebody besides myself. The Umatilla County Fair opened on a Wednesday that year, the last week of August, hot enough that the dust off the midway hung in the air past sundown. I hadn't planned on bringing the combine anywhere. It still didn't run. I'd gotten the header cleaned up and the rust knocked back on the frame, but the threshing cylinder was still a puzzle of parts laid out on a tarp in the granary, waiting on gaskets I couldn't afford yet. But my Aunt Carol entered a jar of her bread and butter pickles in the canning competition, and my Uncle Walt drove the truck in with a load of his prize oats, and somewhere between unloading and standing around not knowing what to do with my hands, a man from the East Oregonian found me. His name was Delbert Voss, and he'd been photographing the fair for 11 years, mostly 4-H kids and blue ribbons, and the occasional prize hog. He'd heard from somebody, I never did find out who, that there was a Pruitt boy up near Athena trying to fix some kind of antique machine his grandfather had squirreled away, and he thought it might make a nice small item for the paper, a color piece about old iron and young hands, that sort of thing. I stood next to it in the low evening light, one hand on the header where the paint had long since given up, and he told me to look serious, then told me to look like I was working, then just let me stand there while he clicked the shutter twice. It took maybe 4 minutes total. I didn't think about it again until the following Tuesday, when the paper ran it on page 6 under a headline that called it, "Athena Teen Restores Grandfather's Relic," which Walt thought was funny enough to read aloud at supper, twice, in a voice that made it clear he still thought relic was the operative word. Nobody in the county seemed to think much of it beyond that. Mrs. Halverson at the feed store said it was a nice picture and asked when I planned to get a real tractor. Ray Kessler, who'd offered me the $40 back in the spring, saw me at the co-op and said he hoped I hadn't gone and fallen in love with a pile of rust, because love didn't pay off harvest loans. My mother clipped the article anyway and put it under a magnet on the icebox, next to a grocery list and a card from the bank reminding us the payment was due the first of the month, and if there was any significance in a torn piece of newsprint traveling farther than any of us could have guessed, nobody standing in that kitchen had the faintest idea of it yet. The letter came on a Thursday, the 14th of October, in an envelope so thin I nearly set it aside with the seed catalogs. The stamp was foreign, a profile of a woman I didn't recognize, and the postmark said Cardiff. Inside was a single typed page from a man named Gwilym Prosser, who identified himself as curator of agricultural machinery at a museum outside Swansea, and who wrote, in the careful, over-polite English of someone translating courtesy from another language in his head, that a photograph reprinted from an American newspaper had come across his desk by way of a colleague who collected agricultural clippings as a hobby. He said the machine behind me in that photograph bore, unless he was very much mistaken, the distinctive drum and apron threshing arrangement of a design patented in 1936 by a manufacturer in Rock Island, Illinois, a company he named as though it should mean something to me, and which folded, he said, in 1941 amid litigation he described only as regrettable. He said 3 units had been built. He said he had spent 11 years trying to locate even one. I read it standing at the kitchen table with my boots still on, and I read it again, and then I carried it out to the granary where the combine sat with its new belt and its patched apron, and I stood there a long while just looking at it, like it might say something back. I wrote to him that same night, a short letter, because I didn't know what else a person was supposed to say to a stranger across an ocean who seemed to think my grandfather's rust pile was something the world had been quietly missing. I told him what I knew: the year, the price, the traveling salesman, the lawsuit my grandfather had mentioned once and never explained. I mailed it Friday morning, before chores. The reply didn't come by mail. It came on a Wednesday evening, the 20th, through the exchange in Pendleton. A call routed operator to operator, with so much clicking and long-distance hiss that at first I thought the line had dropped. Then a voice came through, tinny and careful, asking, "Was this the Pruitt residence? Was I the young man in the newspaper?" I said I was. He told me, across 4,000 miles of wire, that if the machine was what the photograph suggested, it was one of only 3 ever built, that the other 2 were known to have been destroyed, one in a barn fire in Nebraska in 1952, and that what I had standing in my granary might well be the last one left on the earth. I didn't say anything for a moment. Behind me in the kitchen, my mother had stopped drying dishes, and Walt had come to stand in the doorway, with his hat still on, listening. The man on the line said his name was Emrys Price Talfin, and he said it twice, slow, the way you say something you expect to be misheard on a bad connection. He told me he curated agricultural machinery at a museum outside Cardiff, a converted mill building with 3 barns of restored equipment, and that he had spent 11 years trying to trace what he called the Kessler-Vance anomaly, a threshing cylinder design patented in 1937 by a small outfit out of Rock Island, Illinois, that ran the grain through at an angle nobody else had tried before or since. He said the design cut grain loss nearly in half over the standard machines of its day, that it should have changed the industry, and that it had instead vanished into a patent fight so ugly the company folded before a single lawyer got paid. Kessler sued Vance, he said, or Vance sued Kessler. The details had blurred across 4 decades and an ocean, but the result was the same. The tooling was seized, the drawings scattered, and the 3 machines that existed went wherever unwanted machines go. 2 of them, he'd confirmed through correspondence with a historical society in Lincoln, Nebraska, and a dealer's estate sale record in Sioux Falls, were gone. One burned with a barn in '52, the other cut up for salvage during a wartime scrap drive in 1943, the irony of which he mentioned like it pained him personally. The third had simply disappeared from the record after a Midwest traveling salesman took his last sample unit west in 1938 and stopped filing reports. That salesman, he said, may have sold your grandfather the only surviving physical proof that the design ever worked. I looked over at Walt while he said it. My uncle had his hat off now, turning it slow in his hands the way he did when he was deciding what to feel about something. He didn't say anything, but something in his face had gone loose, like a fence post finally giving after years of frost heave working at it. He'd spent all August wanting that machine gone for $40 in scrap weight, and now a man's voice from across an ocean was telling us it might be the last one of its kind left standing anywhere in the world, and I could see him doing the arithmetic on his own certainty, subtracting what he'd been so sure of from what he now had to carry instead. Mr. Price Jones cleared his throat on the other end, a sound like static folding over itself, and said the museum's board had authorized him to make a formal offer, and would we like to hear the number now or discuss terms first. My mother's hand found the edge of the table. Walt's hand was already there, flat, like he was holding the table down instead of the other way around. $4,500, he said. American. Nobody spoke. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen behind us. That same tired Frigidaire hum it had made my whole life. And I remember thinking it was strange that a sound so ordinary kept going right through a moment like that, like it hadn't heard the number either. Walt said, "Say that again," not because he hadn't heard it, but because he needed the room to hear him ask. Mr. Price Jones said it again, slower, like he was reading it off a card, and added that the museum would arrange and cover all shipping costs to Cardiff, and that the machine would be displayed with a plaque bearing my grandfather's name. I looked at the ledger sitting on the table, still open to the last page my grandfather had written in, the ink gone brown, the handwriting gotten shaky, toward the end, the way a man's hand does when the rest of him is already leaving. I thought about the combine sitting out past the granary with its skeleton showing, and about the $40, and about how close we'd come to letting a man haul it off for its weight in iron. "Mr. Price Jones," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, "we'll take the offer. But I want to ask something first." Walt's head came up. "If your museum's got engineers who understand this design, good as you say," I said, "would they be willing to build a working copy, not the real one, just something that runs the same way, and let it stay here? We'd sell you the original. You keep the copy running on our land, on loan, however you want to call it." There was a pause on the line long enough that I thought the connection had dropped, just crackle and ocean between us, and I watched Walt's jaw work like he was chewing on whether I'd just ruined the whole thing by asking for more than any of us had a right to. Then Mr. Price Jones laughed, short and surprised, and said he'd never had a seller negotiate for less money before, only ever for more, and that he'd need to bring it to his board on Monday, but that he personally thought it was, in his words, a rather elegant solution to a rather stubborn problem. The board said yes. Took them 3 weeks to send the papers, and by the time the check cleared, $4,500, drawn through a bank in Portland that had never handled a wire from Cardiff before and made a small production of it, it was the second week of November, 1971, and my uncle drove into Pendleton himself to pay off the note at the co-op. He came back that evening and set the receipt on the kitchen table without a word, just slid it across to me like a man returning something he'd borrowed too long. We didn't talk about the $40 again after that. Didn't need to. The combine left in February, on a flatbed truck driven by a man from a shipping outfit in Seattle, who'd clearly never loaded anything stranger in his life. It went by rail to the coast and by boat after that, and I got a photograph in the mail some months later. The machine standing under a roof of gray Welsh slate, cleaned up, painted, a small brass plaque screwed into the frame near the header that read simply, "Restored in memory of the man who refused to let it die. Pendleton, Oregon, USA." I keep that photograph in the same ledger my grandfather started in 1938. Feels right, keeping it there. The replica came that same spring, built off the drawings the Welsh engineers made before the original ever left the county, put together by a machine shop in Walla Walla that treated the job like it was reassembling a cathedral. It's not the same machine. It never will be. But it runs the same way his did, threshes the same way, and it sits in the same shed the old one rotted in for 33 years, except now the roof doesn't leak on it. I still farm those 240 acres, have for a long time now, and I'll tell you what I've come to believe. For whatever it's worth, most of what people call junk is just something nobody's bothered to look underneath. A barn loft, a root cellar, a drawer nobody's opened since a funeral. Somebody in your family kept something because it mattered to them once, and mattering doesn't wear out the way metal does. So if there's a place like that in your family, a shed, an attic, a box under a bed, go look. You might find nothing. You might find the only one left in the world. If you've got a story like that, tell it below. I'd like to hear it. And if this one was worth your time, stick around.